Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 2024 Dean Speaker Series at the Edwards School of Business. My name is Marjorie Delbar, and I have the privilege of being the acting dean of the Edwards School of Business for this coming year. I am very, very pleased to see such a full room, and I know there are still some spots available. It's hard to see them, but a full room of students, faculty, staff, alumni, and friends of the college, and it's wonderful to see everybody coming out for this particular event. We also have a number of people joining us on live stream, and so a shout out to everybody who is joining us through that feed. As we gather today, we acknowledge that we are here on Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis. And as part of this land acknowledgement, we acknowledge the original ancestors and caretakers of this land and reaffirm our relationships with one another. And I feel very privileged to be able to call this beautiful land home. And, you know, when I reflect on the importance of these land acknowledgements, it's really what I see as the first step towards that journey of reconciliation. And I'm very happy to see the widespread use of land acknowledgements here at the University of Saskatchewan and at the Edwards School of Business. You know, it's one of the initiatives that we're undertaking. Another one of the initiatives that we've undertaken is to introduce a course called Indigenous Business in Canada as core to the Bachelor of Commerce curriculum. And that's something that was new in 2021. And so in that spirit, I am very pleased to be able to welcome our speaker for this particular series this year. And the goal of kicking off our academic year with this is to provide inspiration, to showcase the business leaders that we have in this province, in this great country of ours, and to celebrate the impact that they have made and that they continue to make on our communities. And this year, I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Bill Lomax as the Dean's speaker. Bill is a member of the Gitxsan Nation. He grew up in Terrace, British Columbia, and studied in Vancouver before heading south to spend 22 years working on Wall Street and in private equity in the United States. Bill is a graduate of UBC's law school and obtained his MBA from Columbia University. He began his career as a lawyer facilitating land claim negotiations for the British Columbia Treaty Commission. He later worked for the Canadian Federal Department of Justice before entering the investment sector in the United States, working for firms such as Merrill, Lynch, and Goldman Sachs. Bill is the president and CEO of First Nations Bank of Canada. The First Nations Bank of Canada is a federally chartered bank with decades of experience serving Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples throughout the country. Bill believes the First Nations Bank of Canada will be a catalyst to create economic growth that is inclusive and sustainable in Indigenous nations and communities. Today, he will speak about Indigenous financial nation building and the future of Indigenous business. A bit of housekeeping before we begin. Following Bill's talk, there will be a Q&A portion of this event, and I will encourage you to ask questions at this time. We have a mic in the room, and we also have the ability to take questions from our live stream audience, but if there is a question that you have, we would ask that you enter that into the chat and that it will be relayed to me. So I will facilitate that Q&A portion of the event. But with that, I would ask you to please join me in welcoming Bill Lomax.
Thank you. Good to see you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Dean Delbar. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes? Okay, great. Well, I hope your academic year's been off to a good start. It's great to be here with the future of our business communities here in Saskatoon, across Canada, and globally. I want to thank the Dean and the Edwards School of Business for the opportunity to speak with you today. My message to you is really going to be pretty straightforward. The landscape in Canada has changed for business. We're in a completely different world than we were even, say, 20 years ago. And I don't mean in the way that you might be thinking, you know, we have AI, we have green energy, we have all these great things that are happening around us. But as important as those things are, I'm talking about the way First Nations are interacting with business in this country. There's really been unstoppable advancements that we've seen over the last, call it 20 or 30 years. We have growing ambitions, growing capacity, and most importantly, our participation in business really is crucial now in a way that it has never been in the past in this country. I'll get to all of that in a minute or two, but let me just give you a little bit of my background. Thank you, Dean, for talking a little bit about it. I did grow up in a northern community in British Columbia. It felt quite remote. It's about a 16-hour drive from Vancouver. It was a very different time when I was growing up. Racism was pretty overt when I was a kid. And, you know, in a small town like Terrace, the best jobs were at the sawmill or at Safeway, because these were union jobs, right? And people aspired to that. I knew as a kid that that wasn't what I was destined for. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew that wasn't it. But, you know, when I think about Wall Street, I didn't even know what Wall Street was as a kid, right? It just was a completely foreign concept. I'd never heard of it. What I knew about a bank, well, I'd been to the bank with my parents and watched them open a bank account for me and cash a check, get some cash out, make a deposit, that kind of thing. But I really didn't understand what finance and banking were about at all. And I had nobody in my life that had that kind of experience, right? No mentors to kind of look up to. So if you have those kind of mentors, good, because it's a helpful thing. I ended up doing as was mentioned, my undergrad and law degree at UBC. Money, although I like it, was never really a primary motivator for me, right? I always wanted to do stuff that I was interested in. And so I started my career at the BC Treaty Commission, which really was a group organized to help facilitate modern day land claim negotiations in British Columbia. And it was, you know, an area where I thought I could have a meaningful impact. But as I worked there, one of the things that I realized was that there was all these nations that were theoretically coming into a lot of money, and they had good political leaders, and they had good lawyers, and they had nobody who understood finance. Really nobody, certainly not investments, not at that time. So although I was grateful for that experience, I really started to think about where could I make a bigger impact over a long period of time. And so I started to realize that finance and the world of finance was an area that was going to be really important, because even though you had these nations that were theoretically coming into big compensation, you know, land coming back to them, large cash settlements, what happens after that money came in was really what was more important. Because getting the money and if it all went out, it all disappeared, it might as well not have happened. In fact, in a lot of cases, you could see folks being worse off than they were beforehand. So I wanted to learn about finance, about money as a tool for nation building. And that was really why I went down to the States to get an MBA. And as was mentioned, I think I went to Columbia University, which was a great experience. And then I spent the better part of 20 years working on and off Wall Street. And primarily on the investment advisory business. And I loved it. And quite frankly, you know, I thought I'd finish my career there. What's not to love about being a Goldman Sachs banker in San Francisco, right? High income, beautiful city, lots of great things going on. You've got that problem of Trump over here, but you know, you can figure out around that maybe. But then an opportunity came up for me about a year and a half ago. And it was to come here and run this bank. It's an opportunity to apply everything that I'd learned down in the States and play a significant role in the financial success of First Nations here in this country. I felt the call really of great purpose. And I don't know how many of you feel that, but for me, it's always been kind of palpable, right? Something I think that really, it just trumps, there's that name again, trumps things like salary, right? Salary is important. It is important to have your daily needs met, and you know, often you have goals. But for me, you know, it's not the only motivator, not by a long shot. And when you think about business, it's really about identifying what people want and need. And I think if you want to be motivated, it's really helpful to find a connection between what you want and what you need in your career choices, right? How do you connect that to your mind and to your heart? So that has always sort of been top of mind for me. When I reflected on it and I saw this job opportunity to come home, it was really an easy choice. And so here I am. So, and let me tell you a little bit about why. Indigenous communities across the country are in the midst of what I like to think of as an opportunity revolution. What I mean by that is we're in a time when First Nations and Indigenous communities have more opportunities than they've ever really seen in the past. I can't tell you how many deals we see at the bank that are for, 10 million, 20 million, 50 million, hundreds of millions of dollars. If you think back to the 80s, way back when, I know most of you weren't born then, but back in the 80s, there was probably, in the last 6 months, more opportunities for First Nations that came up in all of the 80s, right? When you think about it from a dollar perspective. So that's a huge difference between what we've seen from 40, 50 years ago to where we are now. First Nations have an opportunity to dream. First Nations people have the opportunity to think about having security, having a home, sending their kids to good schools. Nations have the opportunity to think about and dream about security for their people, long-term health of the community, creating community vitality in a way that just wasn't possible even probably 15 years ago. So if we take a look at the community right now, you'll see that there's optimism in the way we haven't seen before. And if you take a look at the bank that I'm running now, it's really a great story. The only Schedule I bank, Indigenous owned in the country. And in many ways, the success that we have has mirrored the success of the nations across this country. A bank started 28 years ago, and I was telling the dean that if you asked me to start a bank today, I'd tell you it's a terrible idea. Just like the amount of work that you have to put into it, the amount of risk that goes with it, terrible idea. Fortunately, I wasn't the one to start the bank. So they persevered, and we have some of our first founders over here. They persevered, and they built it into something that's really quite incredible today. We have 21 full-service branches and service centers across the country. The big banks, they're closing branches and consolidating. We are expanding. We're opening new branches. Why are we going against the trend? Well, because Indigenous communities need access to capital. They need access to financial information. They're looking for wealth strategies, and they want to develop financial literacy. Money is a really effective tool for creating personal wealth and also for nation building. It's really the crucial tool for nation building. But it can intimidate a lot of people, scare them even. So what we're trying to do is use money and apply it as, sorry, let me step back for a second. But knowing how to use money is really important. Applying it for the benefit of your community and for yourself, right, and your family. But it's something that anybody can learn. This is not mysterious, right? All of you in here are learning about this, but think about family members who maybe haven't, right? This is a skill that everybody can learn. But a lot of First Nations folks may not have felt welcome in banks in the past. Maybe they felt judged, like they didn't belong there. We're here to try and fix that so that when a First Nations grandfather and granddaughter walk into a branch to open up an account, they don't end up sitting on a curb with handcuffs on like they did in Vancouver just a few years ago. I'm not talking 20 years ago, I'm talking 2020. All of you were around then, right? That literally happened. So, First Nations Bank, 87% Indigenous owned, 70% of our staff is Indigenous, and over half of our board and senior management are Indigenous. Earlier this year, we inked a deal with the Canada Infrastructure Bank for $100 million that will allow us to bring out a new product that will allow Indigenous communities to build infrastructure at below market rates. It's a really great program and an exciting thing. First Nations are really wanting to take control of their situation, of their communities, and become self-reliant. This is one of the little stepping stones to get there. As one First Nations leader said, if we wait for the feds to build schools or build an arena, it's going to take 20 years. If we do it ourselves, we can do it in 1 or 2 years. We're helping to put that control back into their hands. So we're building or opening branches in First Nations community. They provide full financial services for those communities, whether you're Indigenous or not. We recently opened a branch in Ermineskin Cree Nation, which is in Alberta, and it's our second branch in that province. So very exciting for us. They're a nation that's on the move. Their vision statement is that they want to be united, strong, healthy, and sovereign. That's what we're looking for all the nations that we work for. We work closely with them in their economic development arm, and that economic development group now owns 18% plus of the bank. What's the significance of a branch in that community that is owned by First Nations Bank compared to any other that might be in the area? First of all, there aren't a lot, right? We actually displaced a bank in order to move into their spot because they weren't very happy with their last bank. But when you go in to First Nations Bank, one of the key differences is you're going to feel a cultural connection. There aren't many banks where you can go and smell buffalo grass, also known as sage, in there. You're not going to see a drum circle, right? You're not going to be able to speak in Cree or Inuktitut or any other First Nations or Indigenous language. You can at a lot of our branches. So it's a very different situation when you come in. Now, I think when we think about sort of the opportunity set that First Nations are coming, this opportunity revolution, if you will. I think a lot of people think, well, change is afoot. There's some danger here, right? We have a new government coming into place. And if the Liberals are moved out, won't the Conservatives be a lot less likely to help us move forward as a community? Won't it come to an end? Well, we all know that budgets and deficits are very inherently political issues. Official reporting last year from the Government of Canada stated that $76 billion needed to be set aside to settle financial claims with Indigenous communities right now. That's 7 times greater than before Prime Minister Trudeau came into office. A lot of bureaucrats question these amounts and the impact that they're having on the deficit. They complain that the budget would be balanced if it weren't for having to make these kind of reparations. Certainly there have been massive game-changing settlements lately, right? And we've seen that. You have $10 billion at Robinson Huron in Ontario. Here in this province, the Lac La Ronge Indian Band had just signed a $600 million deal settlement with the federal government over what's known as cows and plows. That's from Treaty 6. Essentially, you had a guarantee from the government for since, 1889, that people were going to get cows and plows. They didn't. And so as finance students will understand the power of compounding and inflation over that period of time, they owed a lot of money. And so this is just one little piece of it. So there's no going back on this, right? Governments change, they come and they go. But the Thunderbird, our version of the Phoenix, is rising. It's a different time now. The Indian Act was signed in 1876. It's still in existence today. This was the single most repressive act ever passed by the Canadian government. It crippled ambition. It killed dreams of a better life. There used to be an old saying, kill the Indian, save the man, right? That was kind of the attitude in the past. But now we're transcending that. We're not going to let the Indian Act hold us back anymore. And we have a clear sense of identity and purpose and clout. Let me give you some key statistics about Indigenous advancement. 30 years ago, there was dire poverty in most Indigenous communities across this country. The wage gap for First Nations people was really quite significant. The average First Nations person earned about 66% of the average wage of a non-Indigenous person. Now the picture is quite a bit brighter. The mean hourly wage gap between Indigenous workers and their non-Indigenous counterparts varies between about 5% and 11.6%, depending on where you measure it in the country. Clearly, there is still work to do here, but it is trending in the right direction, and education is a key component, which is, of course, a good message to give in this kind of a room, right? According to Statistics Canada, and this is a little bit dated, 2016, 63% of First Nations youth aged 19 to 30 had completed high school. The number rose to 73% for those off reserve. Some of the problem clearly is access on reserve, which many First Nations are now starting to address by building their own schools in their own community development plans that help to make it a more attractive place for the youth and give them some hope for those that are on reserve. They reinforce the importance of cultural traditions and taking more control of the education system. And so it's becoming a very different situation on reserve. And there's more good news to that. Despite facing challenges, Indigenous peoples have made a lot of strides in education. So while we still have lower university graduations, 23% of Indigenous people have college credential behind them, right? And 11% have completed apprenticeships. Those numbers are higher than the general population. So change has happened here in Canada, and like I said, we're not going back to that. If business interests want to do business, they want to develop lands in any kind of significant way, they need our consent, our involvement, and our cooperation. Recently, Chief Michelle Joe was appointed as a strategic advisor to a company called World Energy for the New Geonic project out in the East Coast. It means where the sand blows. Bay St. George is on the western coast of Newfoundland. It's one of the world's best wind resource areas and a great place for the project that they have going on. The project is going to be Canada's first commercial green hydrogen and ammonia producer with 4 gigawatts of renewable electricity generated by wind farms. Chief Michelle Joe, who recently retired as chief of the Miwapattuk First Nation, is one of the longest serving Mi'kmaq chiefs in Atlantic Canada. So he has authority, he has trust, and he has power. He's done a lot for his community. He stood up to government and church officials as he was developing his community from a place where they had no running water, no sewers, and low employment, into a thriving success story, a Thunderbird economy, if you will. He'll advocate for First Nations, help them realize the advantages with the clean energy in his new role at World Energy. It's a great position for him. I want to share 2 more business stories before we finish up here. The first is a James Bay hydro project in Quebec, the world's largest hydro project. It was started in the 1970s. It was Premier Robert Bourassa's dream to make this happen. The Cree, on the other hand, called it the bulldozer invasion. Very different perspectives on this, right? They sent in bulldozers because there was no roads at the time for them to get there. They said the James Bay Cree had no rights. They came to the territory, didn't acknowledge that the Indigenous people even lived there. But the Cree, they were not folks that were going to be easily bulldozed out of the way. As Bill Lomax said at the time, in the far north, they didn't know there was an Indian Act. So they operated like the Indian Act didn't exist. A number of Cree nations organized themselves to unite. They confronted the Canadian and Quebec governments as one forceful entity. The newly established Grand Council of Crees won an injunction against the Quebec hydro project. It was short-lived, but they got an injunction. The Quebec government appealed and won, arguing that the needs of millions of people in Quebec outweighed the rights of 1,000 or so Indigenous people in northern Quebec. And that was really the attitude, like, they don't matter, right? But it only triggered a lot more court cases. By 1975, an agreement was reached. The Grand Council of the Crees achieved it because when Quebec extended their territory in 1898 and 1912, they had agreed to take care of Indigenous rights. That's the crux of the argument, because they didn't do that. They didn't take care of the Cree rights. So as they were coming through the agreement, the Crees really took a different approach than historically had been taken. They included chapters in the agreement that covered local government, health, education, justice, income security, administration, environment, social impact. All of these kind of clearly government-focused clauses in the agreement, and it really became the first modern treaty with self-government included in it. It was really revolutionary at the time. Still, that wasn't the end of the conflict with the Quebec government. In the 1990s, Bourassa came back with the Great Whale Project, a 3,000 megawatt complex near La Grande River. The Grand Council and the environmental allies shut that down quite quickly by court cases in Canada and court cases in New York, among other places. Needless to say, Quebec felt a lot of economic damage to that. The project was worth billions to the province. So finally, in 2002, the Quebec government decided that they wanted to make peace with the Cree people. Again, the settlement was unusual and creative, called Paix des Braves, or the Peace of the Braves. It called for revenue sharing and not equity. Now, why is that sort of germane? What's the importance of that? Well, a lot of opportunities right now, folks are looking for equity stakes. Participation means equity. The Cree said, you know what? We don't trust that Quebec Hydro actually knows how to run a business well, so we'll just take cash off of the money that comes in on a guaranteed basis rather than equity. And considering Quebec Hydro has certainly had its ups and downs and near bankruptcy moments, they made the right decision. Equity is not always the best option. Often it is, but it's not always. So that sharing of revenues and joint management by the Cree and Quebec of mining, forestry, and hydroelectric resources on the traditional lands in Quebec really was their forceful step into self-government. As part of the 50-year agreement, they end up getting on an average of, it's indexed, of about $70 million a year to their nations. As part of it, the Cree demanded that Quebec transfer all of the treaty obligations to them, meaning that if the government was currently providing education, they would provide education. They would take the money to do it themselves. Again, governing themselves. They wanted control, and they got it. 6 years later, the Grand Council of Cree, having dealt with the Quebec government, took on the federal government. And the so-called New Federal Relation Agreement was signed by the Cree in Canada in 2008. It was inspired by the Paix des Braves. It resolved 30 years of dispute over the implementation of the 1975 James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement, the one we were just talking about. The payout, $1.4 billion, a very significant sum. And that's what I mean when I talk about clout and ambition and resilience and the determination of the First Nations. They worked hard, they were smart about it, and they made this happen. They were the trailblazers of what I think of as the Opportunity Revolution, as I've called it. Another Opportunity Revolution example is in Sydney, Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. Terrace Paul, chief of the Member 2 First Nation and CEO of their development corporation, is a legend in Canada. For nearly 40 years as chief, he guided the Member 2 community to incredible economic, social, and cultural and governance transformation. He was a residential school survivor. He'd left his community to find work when he was in his 20s and ended up down in Boston. He worked in factories and later for the Boston Indian Council, where he learned finance and management, helping Indigenous people across New England get training. After 7 years, he returned home and he was soon elected chief. The community's finances were not in good order, as you might imagine. No one understood money. They didn't even understand how much money they were owed by the federal government for things that they were supposed to have received already. But he got the financial house in order, and he took risks. By doing all of that, his community has flourished. He says he did it by ignoring the destructive and racist Indian Act that condemned his people to emotional and economic ruin. Along with other business-oriented reserves like Whitecap Dakota here in Saskatchewan and in West Bank First Nation in British Columbia, they were one of the first agitators, early agitators. They pushed Ottawa to allow them to overlook the portions of the Indian Act that meant that they couldn't make investments on their own. As a result, he built a new economic frontier by generating substantial revenue through the development of a convention center, hotel, bingo, hall, sports complex, gas stations, bowling alley, a lot of other businesses. And they brought in people from around the communities to help support those businesses. They built those businesses to serve the bigger community. Member 2 is really considered one of the most progressive First Nations, and economically, they're really one of the most economically flourishing ones in the country. And it's the third largest employer in Cape Breton, employing more than 500 people. So let me move on to our next one here. They've just done incredibly well. Great story. If you haven't had a chance to learn about them, spend a little bit more time on it. The biggest thing that you might have heard about was that in 2001, Chief Terry at the helm, they made the single largest investment ever in the Canadian seafood industry by a First Nation. They acquired a 50% stake in Clearwater Seafoods, the largest shellfish producer in North America. And what does Chief Terry say about that? And he says, well, it's 50% for now. They have a pathway to taking 100% of the company. So in closing, I want to encourage you to share in the dreams of First Nations, to join with Indigenous peoples in the opportunity revolution. Development and partnerships with First Nations are among the most promising and interesting opportunities in this country. There's still work to do to build capacity, to improve access to education, to build wealth in our communities. But this is not just about economic reconciliation. It's about building a better and more inclusive, more prosperous Canada for us all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill, for that insightful and inspiring talk. Thank you very much. We can move on to the question and answer portion of the event. As I mentioned before, we have a microphone. So if anybody has a question for Bill on his talk, maybe even also on your experience working in finance and in the business world across North America, I would encourage you to please come up to the microphone. I know we do have some people joining us online. And if you have a question and you're online, if you enter it into the chat, we will get through to some of those questions later on as well. See, is there a brave soul who can start us off? Yes, please.
You mentioned you started off financial advising and then you moved into the banking sector. Can you describe what that process was like, please?
Well, when I got to New York, I did my 2 years at Columbia University, and then pretty much straight from there, I started applying to banks here in Canada and surprisingly got almost no response. It was crickets all over the place, and I had several institutions interested in the States. There's an old saying about in finance about being early is the same as being wrong. And I was early in the idea of managing money for tribal nations. The nations that I was working with were really just starting to come into their money, but they hadn't become wealthy quite the way they did by the end of my career. Over the time frame that I was there, their wealth increased enormously. And so I was a little early, but only by a few years. So it worked out. But I ended up working with Smith Barney, which got bought by Citigroup, and then ended up over at Morgan Stanley. That group got punted around a little bit. But it was an interesting place to start. It was basically, they just transformed, or changed the name, if you will, for the people that were doing my job from stockbroker to financial advisor. And selling single stocks wasn't really the goal anymore. It really was about building portfolios for people. So I spent a lot of my career building portfolios based on stocks, bonds, private equity, hedge funds, that kind of thing.
I saw another hand up. Do you want to ask your question?
So, as you mentioned in your speech, that right now your vision for the bank, the First Nation Bank, is to expand their branches and to have the access more to the indigenous community. So in Saskatoon right now, I noticed that the amount of like First Nation Bank is not very much compared to like the dominant banks, other banks in Canada. So do you have like a specific vision or like a pathway for you for the indigenous bank to grow more and start to competing against other banks and create more access for many other people from all races and genders?
Yeah, absolutely. We have 21 branches and community banking centers across the country now. Branch banking is part of what we do for sure. It's not the bread and butter for the company. It is more of an important part of the service. So, we are although we are a for-profit enterprise, we absolutely have a social mandate. So we have to build out branches. Our focus won't be in urban centers. It will be in smaller communities, bringing it out to reserves that maybe don't otherwise have access to banking when it comes to that kind of thing. But our commercial banking area, ears ticking up for anybody who's thinking about commercial banking, is going to grow by about 50 to 100% in the next few years. The goal is by 2029 to double our commercial banking group. We'll also very much, right now we have a trust business, but it's very much the administrative side of things. In my career, I grew up in the investment management side, building out portfolios. So we're going to also build out a wealth management platform. Again, for those of you a year or two from graduation, should be thinking about talking to us. Just little shameless plugs there. Sorry. We as a bank, we compete with all the big banks. We pay the same kind of wages that all the big banks do. But if you get up in the morning, I'll be honest, when I was working at Goldman, I was doing quite well, but there were people who were doing astoundingly well, right? There was guys on my floor that made more than the CEO of RBC. Like literally, that was the kind of money these folks were making. But they got up in the morning and they helped billionaires save hundreds of millions of dollars in taxes. I couldn't get my ass out of bed for that, excuse the language. I don't care, right? That's just not enough for me. So for me, having that social purpose, along with what I get up to do in the morning, pardon me, is very important. Sorry.
And there's nothing shameless about a plug. We're all behind all of that.
Yes.
Any other questions, or Carly, there's some from online? Okay.
I have a question from Kelly Lindsay in the chat, so thank you, Kelly. He asked, how do you see the role of innovation in the Indigenous business domain, and what are your observations comparing the US and Canada in economic innovation?
In this space, it's really quite interesting. I think as we grow, we have to decide what we want to do on the innovation front. Because what we do right now, if you will, is kind of analog, right? We have our digital strategy, and it's important for what we do, absolutely. But if we really ever want to, I think 60%, 55% of all First Nations and Indigenous folks live off reserve. We're never going to have enough branches to serve all of them. So at some point, the question is do we become a challenger bank? Challenger bank is a bank that's very tech heavy, tech focused. And I'm not saying that we're going there, but it is something that we have to think about so that we can reach people who are off reserve as well. And for those in remote communities where we're not going to get a branch or a physical location. So technology is absolutely very much on our mind. We will go through a technological transformation while I'm at the bank. I can't guarantee what it will look like. In terms of technology between the US and Canada, quite frankly, Canada is often the testing ground for technology in the banking industry. ATMs happened here first, right? Canada is this, from a banking standpoint, this nice, interesting little petri dish that you can experiment with on all these things. So you actually end up seeing a lot of that here first. And in the States, the technology between what we see down there and up here really isn't much different. The way people make their money, very different. Very gaming focused down there, much more resource and land based up here.
I have a question if nobody else has a question, but I also see some other faculty members in here. Sorry, was there somebody else? Oh, yes, please. I can always ask mine later. Yes, please.
You mentioned that you're from Terrace, BC.
Yes.
I grew up just north of Fort St. John.
Oh, okay.
So
Yeah.
I'm kind of familiar with what the Indigenous communities look like in that area.
Mhm.
And you see a lot of issues with them being so isolated in
Yep.
like kind of giving them resources and supporting implementation of things. So from your perspective, what would that look like in supporting those Northern Reserves, Northern Indigenous communities as a whole, because they're so isolated and may not have the same opportunities that, say, a reserve in interior Saskatchewan has?
Yep. So funny enough, I've been up to Fort St. John a couple of times this year already, and we are seriously looking at a branch there, maybe the first one that we open up in BC. In terms of what's happening up there, there's certainly nations that are struggling with a lot of the issues, and some that are incredibly advanced and super healthy in the way they're managing their finances and their community. We like to think of ourselves as doing the financial part of nation building. So we can enable opportunities through finance to make good things happen within a community. We're not there doing that. So there's a limit to what we can do. But there are more and more nations that are in a position to actually take advantage of what we can provide in terms of financing. So if they want to build a community center, for example, we built one. Kevin, you'll remind me where it was. Where did we just help build that hockey rink? Do you remember that? One of the nations that we worked with didn't have a hockey rink for 20 years. And it had always been in their mind as something they wanted again. And I think their last one burned down. And we helped finance that hockey rink. And that has created, it's one little part of that building a healthy nation. But it brought back a lot of community to the community center activities to that nation. So.
We have another question.
So you mentioned that the First Nation Bank you guys have, it's been around for 20 years.
26, or no, sorry, 28.
Okay. So are there other banks that deal with these windfalls of money that these nations are getting recently?
Yeah. We compete against all the big banks. All the big banks see a profit opportunity here. So they're now at the table the way they weren't 30 years ago, 20, 30 years ago.
So what kind of restrictions are placed on a bank that deals with this type of money? Like, it's not the average money, like it's given through the government, right? So
yeah.
You'd think there'd be some kind of different restrictions on banks that manage these kind of funds.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, like, what does that look like for your bank?
The restrictions are no different than for any other customer, and I think the regulation in this country really is some of the best in the world. We've never had a bank fail in this country. We've had some get in trouble, but we've never actually had a bank fail in this country. So the restrictions that go along with these monies are really no different than from anybody else, unless the nation decides to put restrictions on them. Oftentimes they'll put them in a trust so that they can't be accessed for certain reasons, right? Maybe or they'll have very specific purposes for the money. And so there'll be restrictions around that. But really, when it comes to that kind of thing, that's again, not really for the government to tell the nation what to do with their money. The nation, through their sovereignty, has to make decisions on their own, for their own community, as to what should be done with it.
Thank you.
Sure.
We have another question? Yeah.
Hi, this is kind of a two-parter, but I know you
Sure.
were talking about financial reconciliation. But like on the other aspect, like politically, I was wondering how you feel about like nations that are like seeking sovereignty and organizations like AMSIS and other stuff that are going for political advocacy.
You may know a lot more about that than I do, to be honest. Sovereignty is something that I'm always in support of for nations. But it has different meanings to different people, right? Down in the States, they have a very specific understanding of sovereignty. And it's based on the Marshall Trilogy of cases of, I think, 1812, which basically allows them to kind of thumb their nose at the state that they're in. They have a federal relationship, it's a government-to-government relationship, and they have some relationships with the state, but they pretty much control stuff on their land in a way that doesn't happen in Canada in the same way. There's a lot of nations here that are pushing for that kind of control, and I'm very much a fan of it. So, provided that it can provide for a lot more sensible decisions when it comes to things that are happening in the community. You know, you don't want necessarily, like my community, Northern BC, or a northern community here in Saskatchewan, doesn't necessarily want Ottawa telling them, you know, whether or not they should build a hockey rink or, you know, build a new community center. They want to be able to make that decision locally, and sovereignty is part of having that control.
Right. And more about like that political advocacy. I know you were also talking about like using Indigenous businesses to like form like their own like mini corporations within like a reserve or a nation. How do you like, with that specifically, how do you feel about like one specific reservation like becoming like a huge like their own like political state and having like a business as like their huge market?
I'm not sure if I quite understand the question, but are you asking about like, are you thinking they're going to become their own country of some kind, or what do you think?
Yes, because I know that I have a friend of mine, his father is a political figure, and they're working on creating a sovereign nation in the Whitecap Nation nearby by Dakota Dunes.
Yeah.
And they're beginning to organize their own political organization and movement.
I'm not sure where that sort of where the danger is in them taking more control of their affairs. I don't think there is any, quite frankly. I think the economic development arms are very important because you need to separate business from politics. There are a few good situations where, you know, you've had one long-term leader who's been both the government and leader and the business leader, but more often than not, those leaders and the government side change, and the new person coming in doesn't have the history, doesn't necessarily have the education, doesn't understand the mindset of the people who are running the business. So the business should operate on its own, in my opinion, and sort of the research has shown us that they're more likely to be successful if you separate the business from the government. The two of those things working together can make an enormous amount of good change happen for a nation. So I don't see any. I don't think we're going to see something terrible happen because Whitecap, Dakota wants to have more control over its affairs.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you, Carly. Do we have another question from online? Oh, actually, we have one from in person. Yes.
Oh, don't let him ask a question.
Sorry, I didn't get the list beforehand.
Yes. I'm surprised you let him in the building. No, I mean,
Did you say you didn't want me
Good
to
to
ask
see you,
a
Chris.
question? Good to
Yeah.
see you too, Bill. Just for everybody's knowledge, I've known Bill now for probably, close to a decade. When I was board chair for AFOA Canada,
Yep.
we were fortunate to have Bill
Yeah.
come up here on a couple of different
and
occasions.
in full disclosure, long before I got here, he was an employee of the bank.
Yeah. So just a couple of questions
Sure.
for you on two different matters. One, you mentioned about the influx of capital that's coming into First Nations now as a result of all the settlements that we're starting to see right across the country. What do you see as the potential for, say, in the near future of setting up things like Indigenous operated hedge funds or Indigenous owned private equity type firms that can kind of bridge some of those
Sure.
those issues, especially from an activist investor standpoint. Like we see in the U.S., the hedge funds are really being used to kind of push agendas forward, and whether or not you see that as being a possibility here. That's the first question, and I'll do my second question
Sure.
after that.
So if the first, this is just my experience. I'm not a big fan of hedge funds, but I do like private equity. Hedge funds just haven't, or they're not making the kind of money that they promised for the kind of fees that they charge. So you'll see that the outflow from hedge funds has been very significant for quite a few years, right? So when I build out portfolios, I generally don't put hedge funds in to them. Private equity, on the other hand, has a lot of opportunity for it. I think for a nation, a lot of nations really operate like a private equity firm, right? Private equity is simply not a public company. So if you're buying a business, you're buying a hotel, you're buying a gas station, you're building a casino, these are all private equity investments. Our bank is a private equity investment. So the most successful nations have a diversified portfolio of these public company businesses. And they may also have a portfolio of public company businesses. But for the hedge fund side, I never got involved in an activist investor side of things. So could I see that happening? Sure. Would we get to scale where it would make a huge difference? I don't know. Because to really make that kind of difference, you'd have to have some serious scale. But if you're looking to build community, you can build a private equity fund that very much focuses on investing in the Indigenous community. That kind of thing I think is very interesting.
Yeah, I've been doing a little bit of research on that as well.
Sure.
My second question, as you probably know, I sit on the board of directors of CMHC, and housing is a critical issue right now. What do you see as First Nations Bank role in addressing the housing crisis that we're not only seeing in general in Canada, but also the on-reserve housing issues? And are you looking at partnering with organizations like CMHC, First Nations Market Housing Fund, et cetera?
Well, I talked to your CEO a while back, and we already have a deal with Canada Infrastructure Bank. We're talking to all of the Crown banks, including CMHC, to say what can we do to help you bring out capital and build opportunities within First Nations. In a lot of ways, we have been the privatized development bank for this country, for the Indigenous community. So if there's a way for us to do something with CMHC, and I think there is, we can help deliver that kind of product out to the communities.
Thank you, Carly.
This is from Mark, and they ask, can you speak more about the process of funding projects with the CIB and First Nations Bank of Canada partnerships that you mentioned?
Sure. So this is a really exciting program. This group probably, you're not going to necessarily be the ones who go out and use this money. But basically the way it works is if there's an Indigenous community, whether it's First Nation, Inuit, or Métis, that has land development program that they're going to do. Build a hotel, build a community center, build any number of things, anything where you put a shovel into the ground. You can access funds through us for the infrastructure portion of that at 1%. So that means in most, up to 50% of the entire project. So with that, that means if you're doing a road, for example, and that would be 100% infrastructure, up to 50% of that could be at the 1% money, and then the other 50% would be provided by our bank at normal rates. A couple of months ago, let's say that was 6%. So in the case of a $10 million road, you would have, if you went to another bank, you'd at 6%, you'd be paying $600,000 your first year, right? Makes sense? We got math-minded folks here. In this situation, the blended cost ends up being 3.5%. You pay $300,000 to us, $50,000 to the Canada Infrastructure Bank. The two of those together come to $350,000 on $10 million. So literally over the life of that project, you might save $5 million in interest. So it's really a great great program because you can do that's thinking of a 25-year term, by the way. But yeah, it's a great program and something that pretty much every nation that we talk to about it gets excited about.
Are there other questions in the room? Sounds like there's another one online, Carly.
This is from Kelly, and this is a follow-up from the previous windfalls that were being talked about from our other question asker. So he asked if you could reframe the windfalls that were being referenced as legal decisions that are responding to numerous past grievances or economic wrongs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that makes sense. These are not windfalls, for sure. It is absolutely reparations for money that was owed and never paid. If the government had kept its promises all the way along, there wouldn't be any settlements to be had.
Any other questions in the room? I will indulge myself and ask my question. What do you think will be the biggest challenge to growth? And I know you've got many different areas within the First Nations Bank, but what do you think are going to be some of the most significant challenges that you'll face in growing?
For us or generally for the community?
Oh, that's a good question for me. Yeah, I guess maybe for First Nations Bank, and then
they're similar.
They're similar, right?
Yeah. They're similar. It is qualified staff. The reality is the Indigenous community in the 60s and 70s decided that they needed more teachers and more lawyers. They needed the lawyers to get their rights back, very important. And they needed teachers to help educate their young people. They've been wildly successful in both of those areas. But, there's, if you sort of look at the community, we have almost an overabundance of lawyers. So any of you who are thinking about going to law, take it for somebody who's already been there, stay where you're at. It's a better place. So I think, the reality is we have not enough young people coming into the economic development space, the investment space, the finance space, the accounting space, to meet the demands that we have for the opportunities that are in front of us, right? So if you try to find an Indigenous CFO, and sometimes even a non-Indigenous CFO right now, that's really difficult for First Nations. And yet they're such a critical component of what they need to do to grow from a financial standpoint. For us, finding lateral hires of experienced folks to come and run different businesses is quite challenging. When I think about sort of my age group, there really weren't people in front of me that were doing what I'm doing, right? And there are not as many people behind me as there should be, right? There are not people who are, sort of 40 to 55, not enough 40 to 55-year-olds who have, 15 years or 20 years of experience. So we have to either do one of two things. We have to grow young people like you into these roles. That's absolutely a critical part of it. The other part of it is trying to find lateral hires and repurposing people. So all those people who were lawyers and loving it, but realized that it's really not the best place in the world for them, might want to consider a career shift and come over. And we need to make room for them to be able to move out of teaching, move out of law, move out of a number of different areas. If you're in medicine, we're going to leave you there. If you're in finance already, we love you. You're going to stay there. But there's a lot of folks who could move over into this area, a lot of leaders that could come into our space, whether it's with us or with the communities that we're working with on the investment and financing side.
I will take that plug for business education. Thank you. Yes.
Just on the, I'm just trying to get a sense of the business on reserve land, and I've done a little bit myself. So when you're doing business on reserve land, you have to do the land tenure and usually take a mortgage on a leasehold interest,
Correct.
right?
Yeah.
So the mortgage, though, in the event of a default or collateral, what do you guys look for in the event that something collapses? Do you reestablish it does the bank come in and start managing the asset, or are you looking at how is it different from any other bank?
If it's a leasehold, it's saleable, right?
Yeah, so you'll sell the lease.
We haven't really had to do that. Have we ever had a lease where we've had that situation happen? This is all theoretical because we've never had to do it.
There's a bridge between the nation and the client and us. So
Yeah.
First
Yeah.
Nation, you have the mortgage on or whatever.
Yeah. Hang on. Can we take that?
Can we give them a
Is it going to come off there? There we go. Let's let him say that again.
Hi.
This is Kevin Michael,
So
our
I look
head of
after our
commercial banking,
commercial
by the way.
bank, so I deal with this every day. So really what it is there's a bridge between the client, the bank. In between that's the First Nation itself. So there's a process and an agreement that says you got to collaborate with the nation to make it whole. So what we're trying to move towards is moving away from social housing to market housing. So you're eliminating, again, the Indian Act, where you're creating, just like you can buy a house here in Saskatoon, you should be able to get standard market rates and terms just like you would have in those communities. So those agreements it's really a partnership, tri-party partnership with the nation in terms of repossession or foreclosure. The nation will help you transition that house if you have to foreclose to potentially another community member. So it's a smaller market, but it's effective.
Okay. Just on the specific claims money that's coming in and the other money that's coming in, is that the same type of idea on the collateral? What are you using for?
Are we using those monies as collateral? If they have the money, we can absolutely use it as collateral.
Okay.
If that's the question.
Yeah.
Are you talking trust agreements? Leveraging? Yeah. So you're really, again, bound by the terms of that agreement. So nations can either leverage the return off those trusts or encroach some of the capital in the trust, but it's documented through referendum and ratification.
Okay.
And the bank will be bound by that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions in the room? Carly, online? Okay, well, before I have to put this back in here. But then join me in thanking Bill Lomax for an incredible talk and for indulging us with all the questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Dave.